Hello everybody, welcome to this, what is the final Google Hangout for the Contract Management MOOC. I hope you've all been enjoying your 3 weeks of learning through this MOOC experience. It's certainly been a pleasure for us to be hosting these Google Hangouts. So my name is Sally Hughes and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of IACCM. I'm joined today by Tim Cummins, who's IACCM CEO, and by my colleague Jim Bergman. Jim, I'm not sure where in the world you're based at the moment, but Jim is our VP in Middle East and Asia. Jim travels the world. He's one of the most extensive travelers amongst the IACCM team. But both of you, welcome and thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thanks, Sally.
And I think he's in Singapore.
Singapore,
Yes,
sorry, Jim. Good. So, our topic today is the 10 pitfalls. We, as hopefully most of you will have learned during the course of the MOOC, we undertook some research some time ago and identified 10 key areas of weakness in contract management. Tim, perhaps you'd like to give a little bit of the background as to where this research came from. Just before we do that, sorry, logistics, I nearly forgot, just to ensure that everybody, please do ask questions as we go along. We're keen to hear from you all, and we will try and address as many questions as we possibly can. So if my head darts from side to side, then forgive me, it's not because I'm disinterested, it's because I'm looking at your questions. So Tim, over to you. Perhaps you could give a bit of background as to this research.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And of course, the 10 pitfalls do lie very much at the heart of this particular MOOC. They were something that was introduced right at the beginning, so the background is important. The origins for those 10 pitfalls is that they were based, in fact, originally on an extensive crowdsourced piece of research across multiple corporations around the world, where we were asking members of IACCM to give us their inputs on the experiences they had around lost value. So they were doing it both in terms of what they saw as underlying cause and also what extent it impacted their businesses. From that, we were able to extrapolate at least a theoretical number in terms of likely erosion. And that erosion occurs in two places. One, that many contracts deliver less revenue than was originally expected, or, of course, that the costs increase within that contract, so the profitability is eroded. And then on the buy side of the house, of course, very often that the anticipated savings are not achieved, or that there's a substantial cost overrun against the original expectation of price. So it's on those real things. This is not based on theoretical ideas of what possible value could have been. This is all loss against what should have been. And as you well know, Sally, many of our members have subsequently used the analysis that we undertook to do some validation internally. So they've done internal audits to say, is this true? I think the only other point just worth mentioning, the 10 are not in sequence in terms of which is the biggest and which is the least. They are reflective of the phases during the overall contracting process at which losses are most likely to occur. Now, as it happens, our research suggests, of course, that scope and goals is the biggest single contributor. But view those 10 in terms of timing within a process rather than necessarily their relevant sizes.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what's been really fascinating since we first produced the report on the 10 pitfalls was the way it resonated with organizations. And it didn't matter whether these organizations were small or large, whether it was private sector or public sector. In fact, all of the pitfalls really resonated with everybody we spoke to. And as a result, we have obviously started to undertake further deeper analysis, which we will talk to you about in due course. But I think what is also interesting is that out of the 10, of course, for many organizations, it's 3 or 4 perhaps that are really critical, that are really important. And as you say, organizations then are able to look at those smaller, bite-sized challenges, if you like, and start to really address them. We've certainly seen that happen. Obviously, I'm primarily based in Europe and work with many organizations in this region, all of whom have taken the 10 pitfalls to heart and really started to undertake some more detailed analysis. But Jim, I think it's important for us to look at this on a global scale, and I wonder if you could share with us how you feel that the 10 pitfalls have been embraced in your region, in the Middle East and Asia, for example.
Oh, they've been embraced quite well. They've been demonstrated and reflected in how people do contracting. I was with yesterday a CEO of a large petrochemical company in the Middle East who himself recognizes the importance of putting out, in this instance, important scope. And without that scope clearly defined, large capital projects within his company will either be lost or won. And he recognizes, and I think we all do, that with any journey, the most important step is perhaps the first, and setting up the scope is really that first step. And without doing it well, the rest of the journey is somewhat lost. And he recognizes this. In fact, he indicated yesterday in his boardroom with his senior leadership team that this was an important thing. He wanted to get all of the key stakeholders trained on how to get scopes put together most effectively. But the other pitfalls that are on the list are at times mentioned as well. So I totally agree. It is clearly important in Asia and the Middle East as well.
And obviously, unfortunately, our colleague Catherine Kawamoto has had technical difficulties today joining us, so she's not here with us. But Tim, perhaps I'll address this question to you in terms of the relevance in the Americas as well, because of course IACCM is global, our research is global. Have you seen a difference in the Americas with the work that you've done and the organizations you've spoken to?
No, I think as with Jim, the overall set of pitfalls resonate well. I think a lot of the the dramatic shifts, of course, as we've moved more and more towards services and solutions type agreements, the amount of contract today that is shrouded in 2 big issues, I think. One being that when you have tangible products, I mean, if I'm looking at my iPhone as a tangible product, I can broadly understand what the scope is going to be and what I'm buying. I can touch it, I can feel it, I can determine whether or not it really is fit for my purpose. As we move more and more towards more intangible products and services, we create a much more complicated environment of being sure, have we got mutual understanding? Do I really know what I want? And are you really capable of giving it to me? And particularly as we're operating more and more across linguistic boundaries, cultural boundaries, these things become much more problematic. And it is interesting. I think we've just been doing a study on international contracting, and one of the notable features there is, in fact, the greater difficulty that people in the US seem to encounter when they operate across borders. There's perhaps much less of a tradition of international trade from the US in some respects. I mean, of course, yes, the US has always been a big exporter, but it hasn't been such a massive importer necessarily historically. And when I was comparing the numbers in terms of the degrees of difficulty that different contracting people face as they deal internationally, the numbers were quite noticeably higher in the US, or the percentages quite noticeably higher, because I think, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, countries are smaller, much more familiar with dealing across borders and boundaries. So in a way, actually, the pitfalls, certainly some of them, become even more pronounced when you come into the US.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's questions are flying in, so thank you everybody for this. one of these questions that I want to address is there a specific moment in which there's a danger of miscommunication leading us to a particular pitfall, or is there no difference during the process? I mean, I think, Jim, we would say that miscommunication can be a problem for every pitfall. You know, if there's a miscommunication about scope and goals, then that's going to cause a problem. If there's miscommunication between stakeholders, that's going to cause a problem. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally would agree, and I think many times in cross-border multinational type agreements, the communication and the cultural nuances become much more problematic. Use of colloquialisms, phrases that people might not understand on a global nature. Sometimes, and I see this within Asia quite a bit, particularly Southeast Asia, where if somebody doesn't understand a phrase, they may not ask for clarification. They don't want to put themselves on the spot and admit that they don't recognize what something means, and then they let that ambiguity, that confusion somewhat continue to persist, and that becomes a bigger problem. So I would say, yeah, definitely the communication, it touches almost all the 10 pitfalls, but in terms of the clarity around scope and goals, that certainly is going to come into play significantly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's another question that I just want to pose to you, Jim, or in fact it's more of an observation, which I think is very interesting. This is from Suki Abazi. Personally, from experience, the one pitfall we face in the Middle East, being a contractor in a war zone, is number 8, poor handover from deal team to the delivery team. And often there's a frequent rotation of teams. Is that something that you're aware of in your work in the Middle East, Jim?
Oh, yeah, not only the Middle East, but I see it elsewhere within Asia and other parts of the world, that continual flow of team members on and off the team, it really becomes somewhat problematic. And the organizations who can create somewhat of a roster, a matrix or a map of who's on the team is an important step to trying to mitigate some of the risk off that. But yeah, I think Suki's absolutely spot on with that. It is a challenge with that particular as pitfall, but it does hold true in a number of the others.
Yeah.
Quality of communication, as you've rightly highlighted, is something that flows throughout here.
Yes.
Right.
But I think, you know, to the original question Sally had posed, or that was posed, of is there a moment in time? I think there is absolutely, and it's before you begin.
Yes.
It's the recognition of the fact that actually communication will be challenging, and to evaluate situations and the nature of the participants in a way that you have a coherent communications plan. If you've recognized early on that actually the opportunities for misunderstanding because of cultural, linguistic differences, jurisdictional differences, you know, the differences of the underlying provisions that typically are utilized, differences in negotiation style. If you have a plan for those things, then there will be problems.
Yeah.
And so the way you, not only the way you structure communication, but how you conduct it. For example, all of us live in a digital age. Many of us probably have international friends on Facebook, so we sort of assume, oh well, it's okay, everybody's used to this. But of course, when you're really talking about a serious business issue, you may well need to invest in communication in a different way, or maybe using Facebook ain't going to be the appropriate way. It may be that you do need physical meetings, that you need to ensure that things are not only spoken, but written. You know, we're entering a digital age where we need to think about our communication at 3 levels: the written word, the spoken word, and the visual.
Yeah.
And so beginning to plan communication to facilitate the realities of the relationships we're forming is, I think, absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, and Tim, you know, that's so right. You know, for instance, oh, gee, I've got to get a contract done in the next 30 minutes, and it happens to be midnight in London and 6 a.m. in, you know, Chicago, and I can't get hold of my key stakeholders to get something clarified before I get this done. And so I'm going to go ahead and just go off of their written word, and I might misinterpret or there might be ambiguity in what they wrote, my colleagues said, so I'm just going to grab it anyways, put it into the contract, and or proceed off of that somewhat ambiguous communication. We can't just walk down the hallway. We can't just pick up the phone and ask somebody to clarify at times, just because of the global nature of how many contracting teams are out there, and it does lead to many of these problems. So having that clarity of communication is becoming so vital to the success of these.
I think that's absolutely right. And interesting, we've had a comment from our friend Graham Sloan. Tim, the benefit for the US is that the states trade within themselves and they have a common language and similar culture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably relatively true, although it was very interesting that actually, for example, as those of you who pick up our report on international contracting will discover, Canada won in terms of being viewed globally as the country easiest to do business with, but there was one exception to that, and that was people in the US who apparently find it very difficult dealing with Canada, maybe because they presume that it's really just another state.
Well, that is the challenge, yeah.
And then they start behaving strangely, and they don't even pronounce some of the words right.
I live in the U.S. and I can attest it's easier to deal with Canada than it is to deal with Texas. So yeah.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I think one of the interesting points, though, to make here is that because of this complexity that our communication has today, this, of course, is, and this has come through in the course, in the MOOC programming, this is what has made the discipline of contracting so much more important, because, of course, it does bring that discipline and structure to our communication. Now, as you, of course, will be the first to attest, Sally, we then need to streamline the contracts and design them in a way that actually makes them good communication tools. But I think this is the transformational thing that's going on with contracting right now, that it's moving away from being this legalistic process that deals with specific terms and conditions into a much more embracing approach to defining what our relationship is going to be and making sure that we have covered those nooks and crannies that otherwise are the things that detract from value and cause these pitfalls to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, what of the relevance of the 10 pitfalls to smaller organizations as opposed to big corporates? I mean, clearly, you know, the pitfalls will resonate absolutely with the multinationals who have these complex processes and deal with strategic contracts on a daily basis and managing relationships. But how is this relevant to small business?
Well, maybe I should turn this on to ourselves, Sally. We had an incident, you may recall, just recently, where we were having a conversation with a group, an organization that's actually publishing a very interesting book, which we're contributing to. And we had an interesting conversation there about, well, would we be interested in distributing this book at our Americas conference, which coincides with its launch. And I think both you and I enthusiastically said, yes, absolutely, we think that's a great idea. So the publisher was involved in all of this, and it was only a week or two later that suddenly somebody wrote to us and said, okay, here's the invoice, that we realized that a fundamental area of scope had not been discussed. We had assumed they were simply asking, could we use your conference as a place where we could distribute the book? What they meant was, would you like to buy 400 copies of the book from us and distribute it for free? Rather a different scenario. So I think no matter what size your organization and no matter how competent you think you are, since I suppose we would at least hold ourselves out to have some knowledge in this, many of those pitfalls do indeed bite. And in fact, many of the inputs on our subsequent surveys are illustrating precisely that. You know, that I'm thinking of one of the quotes that I was reading this morning, where it was a failure to tie down what the exchange rate was going to be. And the cost for this particular organisation of that was something like 12,000 UK pounds, I believe. So not an enormous sum, but certainly quite a significant sum if you're a small business, as that one was.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, Jim, please go ahead.
Tim, so, and then in terms of a smaller business, the individual or the area in which this pitfall exists, in my opinion, it has a much bigger impact than on a small organization. If you're a large organization and you've got weakness, it might be somewhat overridden elsewhere in the organization and made up for. However, in smaller organizations, if you've got that deficiency, that pitfall, it's going to become even more pronounced and obvious and impactful to the organization.
I think you also have to go back to the point that, of course, if you talk to many of the larger corporations, particularly here in the US, where there's regulation that requires them to use small businesses, disadvantaged businesses, etc., one of the biggest complaints you get, one of the biggest concerns you get from those large companies is the lack of competence in those small businesses to do contracting. Yeah. Which of course really undermines that business confidence that do they really understand what they're getting into, do they really understand what they're doing, and do they have the innate competence to do it if they haven't actually really understood commercial terms or how to engage effectively with their customers or suppliers.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we've got another question here which I want to address because it will bring us neatly on to the next part of this discussion. But so this is from Sheng Zhu. So often in the rush to achieve contract execution, I've been left with little time to work with the other party in achieving a perfect outcome. Obviously, we've just been talking about that, and we'll come on to that specific matter in just a second. But in your experience, which common pitfalls should I be concentrating on at the time, and what can be fixed later?
That's a great question. Of course, the ideal would be to tackle the pitfall itself around the timing of your engagement, which of course is what you're suggesting. Yeah. We'll discuss briefly in a second. But I suppose certainly best practices would suggest that we do need to build a much better compendium of those things that typically go wrong. I think we've got to remember that while each contract to a degree may have unique characteristics, they are not really truly unique. And there are certain patterns that emerge. So good practice organizations certainly try and look for those patterns of what are the things that typically go wrong? What's my checklist if I'm short of time? What's my checklist of the most likely things that are going to occur? And then, of course, once you've developed your checklist, as you rightly suggest, you can begin to look at the question of, well, which of those could maybe be remediated later and which could not. Now, one of the techniques, Jim, you and I have been using a lot, of course, is around what we term relational contracting. So if you're short of time and you need to make that award or get into that contract, you may be at least able to agree with your counterparty that there will be a subsequent phase of quasi-negotiation where you sit together and work through how you're going to deal with any problems or issues that arise. So, for example, what methods are we going to use for performance management? How are we going to communicate with each other? What happens if there is substantial overrun of benefit or underrun of benefit? We have an array of characteristics that we've identified that don't necessarily have to be agreed before that contract is signed, but which have proven extremely effective in reducing subsequent risk.
Yeah, so it brings us on nicely actually to, of course, what we have now undertaken is much more in-depth research as a result of the original 10 Pitfalls research study that was carried out. This is an example of one of the reports. This is the first report, Scope and Goals. And actually these reports are available for you all at www.iaccm.com/MOOC. You can go to that website, to that URL, and download copies of these reports. But it has been really interesting to undertake that more in-depth analysis. And Jim, perhaps I'll come to you in terms of perhaps your biggest takeaways from this number one, from the Scope and Goals report.
Yeah, I think, frankly, one of the takeaways that a listener to this could really hopefully take is that we do lay out some of the costs of the lack of the scope, clarity around the scope and goals. And I think this becomes a great sort of antidote or counterbalance to the person on your organization or team who might say, well, let's leave this part of the scope intentionally ambiguous. I think anything in life you have to look at the costs and the benefits. And while you now have the cost of that ambiguity or that lack of clarity, you can use it to counter somebody who says, well, let's just leave this intentionally ambiguous. Well, ask them, what are the benefits from doing that? Why would we want to? What's the upside? Because I've got in this report here some of the downside to it, and unless you can give me enough good reasons to make it intentionally ambiguous, here's a bunch of reasons not to make it ambiguous. So I think that is one of the benefits of a report like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from my perspective, one of the, and it sort of links to what you've said, Jim, is the responsibility for people who are the contract experts to take accountability for scope and goals. I mean, so often we're party to the slopey shoulder syndrome, for want of a better description, where somebody will say, well, I do the terms and conditions, the scope and goals is somebody else's responsibility, and they walk away, and of course that leaves often tremendous gaps.
Yeah, I think picking up on Jim's point, I suppose the answer, Jim, is unfortunately there are quite a lot of people in the organization who have an incentive for lack of clarity, and that really often starts at the top. Unfortunately, one of our findings is that typically the more senior the executive who's engaged with the counterparty, the more likelihood there is of any real lack of clarity. We've all, well, not all, but probably many of us have experienced the executive who appears with a napkin with a few pieces of scribble on it and says, contract for that. In fact, I'm just sort of thinking about myself because I produced a napkin just yesterday and gave it to Sally. But I think beyond that, we also have the challenge that very often there's a little bit of an incentive in the pre-award groups, whether it be procurement or sales, to not be quite as clear as they maybe could be, because if they're clear, it could lead to the need to increase the price or to therefore reduce the savings potential. So ambiguity is sometimes playing to people who say, well, actually, I don't really mind because my incentive scheme doesn't really motivate me to be all that clear. And I think that's also something that's included in the report, and it's an important component of that discussion within the business.
Yeah, and Sally, going to your point, somewhat around the silo mentality, and Tim as well, some of your points there, it comes back to the conversation I had yesterday at the CEO in Saudi Arabia, where we were talking about putting some clarity of scope within his organization. He got really somewhat energized about the topic, and we agreed that writing scope was going to be, it's not a soloist sport, it's a team sport, and everyone in the organization needs to work together to create that clarity, and everyone, in his mind at least, is going to be accountable. If there is a lack of clarity, the entire team will be accountable for that lack. And so you owe it to your team, you owe it to the organization to put that clarity together, and we're not going to finger point to one individual for lack of clarity, we're going to point at the entire team. And so if you are going to be a weakness on my team, I've got to either elevate your skills, bring up your ability to create things with greater clarity, or I'm going to have to somehow find a way of getting you off my team. Because I'm not going to be accountable for your misadventures any longer. And I think that's an important message from the top of the organization all the way down to the rank and file within the organization.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important just to pick up on that. It's not a solo sport. I think that's a really key point, and it brings us, the next pitfall. Pitfall number 2 is about it's about timing of engagement. It links very much to another pitfall, which is about stakeholder engagement. All of them do address the fact that it's so important. If you work in a silo, you're going to struggle. But as commercial contract experts, it's our responsibility to bring all of the expertise from the organization together to ensure that you're engaging people appropriately, you're gaining the respect that you need as an individual and a commercial contract expert, and ultimately you end up with much more defined and clear scope and goals.
Yes, I think the team sport issue is a very important one. We live in a world which requires us, I think, to network much more effectively and therefore to exhibit more inclusive behaviors. And if we find we are not being included as part of the team, we have to self-examine as opposed to blaming others for not including us. So all of us have to think about roles as enablers of good business decision-making, of enablers of good teamwork, rather than sitting there as if we were judges, jury, reviewers, approvers. You know, that is never going to be a particularly welcome attribute. And I think equally for those who are on the receiving end of those sorts of behaviours, it's incumbent on them to try and explain to those that they are excluding why it is they are excluding them. Hopefully, most of us are open to behavioural change, but if we don't, we come back to communicate. If we don't communicate effectively, we can operate often in a state of oblivion, and we just presume that other people are exhibiting good ill will or are simply just thoughtless, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So teamwork requires good communication. It requires honest and open and transparent communication. And it is incumbent on all of us, if we want to get good business relationships and good business deals, to engage in those behaviours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the communication piece does resonate right through the all of the 10 pitfalls. So we're coming to the end of our time now. So Jim, I just want to turn to you for any sort of concluding thoughts you might have, some takeaways for our audience.
Yeah, one thing is, Tim raised it earlier, and that these pitfalls, when you look at the list, do go in somewhat the process sequence. And so at any given point in the process, one of these pitfalls is just around the corner from you. And I would encourage you to continue to be vigilant around these. And you never know which direction one of these is going to, come and get you, from whom in your organization or how. But to keep note of them and you somehow try to keep what I'll call knowledge management front and center around these things. Learn from stepping in the wrong pitfalls and pit holes, if you will, and continue to apply those lessons learned so you prevent and avoid them in the future. Don't keep stepping into the same mistake every single time you go through the process, but continually learn from yourself and from others. If you hit one of these pitfalls, share it with some others in your organization so they don't step in it as well. So that's what I'd like to wrap up with.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim, very much. Tim, what about concluding thoughts from you?
Well, there was a great story I heard a few months ago where somebody was making an analogy, and they said, just imagine that you're stuck out in the middle of the Brazilian jungle and there's just a potholed road between you and civilization, and there's an emergency. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no street lighting on this journey they're going to have to undertake, and the only vehicle that's available has no headlights. So you've got a choice of two drivers. Would you like to go with the driver who drives really, really fast, but with absolutely no lights and is guaranteed to hit potholes on a regular basis, at which point you're going to have to undertake repairs? Or would you rather go with the driver who's got a flashlight and actually ensures that driving more slowly is able to anticipate and drive around the potholes? And I think that's probably quite a decent analogy for our pitfalls.
It is indeed, absolutely. Thank you very much. I like that story. So, well, thank you to everybody who's been listening, been participating in the MOOC. As I said at the beginning, I hope you've enjoyed the experience. We've certainly very much enjoyed running through this last 3 weeks with you. We as I said before, have available these reports on the 10 pitfalls for you. So www.iaccm.com/MOOC. So please do go there. There will be more reports coming as well, and we hope very much that you will continue to engage and find out more about how you can prevent some of these challenges within your organization. So thank you very much all for listening, and thank you, Tim and Jim, for your participation today.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks then.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.